Book 4. How the Psychological Characteristics of Races are Modified. Chapter 1. The Role of Ideas in the Life of Peoples. The leading ideas of each civilization are always very few in number. Extreme slowness of their birth and disappearance. Ideas do not influence conduct until they have been transformed into sentiments. They then form part of the character. It is thanks to the slowness of the evolution of ideas that civilizations possess a certain fixity. How ideas take root. The reason has no influence whatever. The influence of affirmation and prestige. The role of enthusiasts and apostles. Deformation undergone by ideas as they penetrate the masses. A universally admitted idea soon influences all the elements of civilization. It is thanks to their community of ideas that the men of each age have a sum total of average conceptions which makes them very much alike in their thoughts and actions. The yoke of custom and opinions, it is not relaxed until the critical ages of history, when the old ideas are losing their influence and have not as yet been replaced. This critical age is the only age in which the discussion of opinions can be tolerated. Dogmas only hold their own on the condition that they are not discussed. Peoples cannot change their ideas and dogmas without being at once obliged to change their civilization. After having shown that the psychological characteristics of races possess great fixity and that the history of peoples is the consequence of these characteristics, we added that it was possible for the psychological elements, as it is for the anatomical elements of species, to be transformed in the long run by slow hereditary accumulations. The evolution of civilizations depends in a large measure on these transformations. Various factors are capable of provoking psychological changes. Wants, the struggle for life, the action of certain surroundings, the progress of the sciences and of industry, education, beliefs, and many other factors exert an influence. We have already devoted a volume, L'Homme et les Sociétés, leur origine et leur histoire, Volume 2, to the study of each of them. It is impossible to treat the matter in detail here. We merely return to it with a view to showing by the choice of a few essential factors the mechanism of their action. It is to this study that will be devoted the present and following chapters. The study of the various civilizations that have succeeded one another since the origin of the world proves that they have always been guided in their development by a very small number of fundamental ideas. If the history of peoples were confined to that of their ideas, it would never be very long. When a civilization has succeeded in creating in a century one or two fundamental ideas in the domain of the arts, the sciences, literature, or philosophy, it may be considered that it has been exceptionally brilliant. Ideas can have no real action on the soul of peoples until, as the consequence of a very slow elaboration, they have descended from the mobile regions of thought to that stable and unconscious region of the sentiments in which the motives of our actions are elaborated. They then become elements of character and may influence conduct. Character is formed in part of a stratification of unconscious ideas. When ideas have undergone this slow elaboration, their power is considerable, because reason ceases to have any hold on them. The enthusiast who is dominated by an idea, religious or other, is inaccessible to reasoning, however intelligent he may be. All he will be able to attempt, and most often he will not make the effort, will be to try by artifices of thought and deformations often very great to bring any idea that seems to contradict the conceptions which dominate him into some sort of agreement with them. If ideas can only exert an action after having slowly descended from the regions of the conscious to those of the unconscious, it is understandable that they will be very slowly transformed, and that the leading ideas of a civilization should be very few in number, and require so long a period for their evolution. We ought to congratulate ourselves that such is the case. Were it not so, it would be impossible that civilizations should have any fixity. It is equally fortunate that new ideas can implant themselves in the long run, for if the old ideas were absolutely unchangeable, civilizations would be unable to realize any progress. Thanks to the slowness of our mental transformations, many generations of men are needed to secure the triumph of new ideas, and many other generations to bring about their disappearance. The most civilized peoples are those whose leading ideas have been able to maintain an equal distance between variability and fixity. History is strewn with the debris of the peoples who have been unable to maintain this equilibrium. It is easy, in consequence, to understand how it is that what is most striking when the history of the various peoples is studied is not the wealth and novelty of their ideas, but, on the contrary, the extreme poverty of these ideas, the slowness of their transformations, and the power they exert. Civilizations are the result of some few fundamental ideas, and when these ideas change, the civilizations are at once compelled to change as well. The Middle Ages existed on two principal ideas, the religious idea and the feudal idea. Its arts, its literature, and its entire conception of life are derived from these ideas. At the time of the Renaissance, these ideas undergo some modification. The rediscovered ideal of the old Greco-Latin world implants itself in Europe, and at once the conception of life, the arts, and literature begin to be transformed. Then the authority of tradition is shaken, scientific truths substitute themselves gradually for revealed truth, and civilization is once again transformed. At the present day the old religious ideas seem definitely to have lost the greater part of their empire, and owing to this fact all the social institutions that were based on them are threatened with destruction. The history of the genesis of ideas, of their domination, of their transformations, and of their disappearance can only be written on the principle of citing numerous examples in illustration. Could we enter into details, we would show that each element of civilization, philosophy, beliefs, arts, literature, etc., is subject to a very small number of leading ideas, whose evolution is exceedingly slow. The sciences themselves do not escape this law. The whole of modern physics is derived from the idea of the indestructibility of force, the whole of biology from the idea of evolution, the whole of medicine from the idea of the action of the infinitely small. And the history of these ideas shows that, although the persons called upon to appreciate them belong to the most enlightened classes, they only establish themselves little by little and with difficulty. In a century in which everything proceeds with such rapidity, and in a field of investigation in which passions and interests have little play, the implanting of a fundamental scientific idea requires not less than 25 years. The clearest ideas, those most easily demonstrable, those which should have aroused the least controversy, were just as long in finding acceptance. Whatever the nature of the idea, whether it be a scientific, artistic, philosophic, or religious idea, the mechanism of its propagation is always identical. It has to be adopted at first by a small number of apostles, the intensity of whose faith and the authority of whose names give great prestige. They, then, act much more by suggestion than by demonstration. The essential elements of the mechanism of persuasion must not be sought for in the value of a demonstration. Ideas can be enforced either by the prestige of the promulgator or by an appeal to the passions, but no influence is exerted by appealing solely to the reason. The masses never let themselves be persuaded by demonstrations, but merely by affirmations, and the authority of these affirmations depends solely on the prestige exerted by the person who enunciates them. When these apostles have succeeded in convincing a small circle of adepts and have thus formed new apostles, the new idea begins to enter the domain of discussion. It arouses at first universal opposition, because it necessarily clashes with much that is old and established. The apostles who defend it are naturally excited by this opposition, which merely convinces them of their superiority over the rest of mankind, and they defend the new idea energetically, not because it is true, most often they know nothing about its truth or falsehood, but simply because they have adopted it. The new idea is now more and more discussed. That is to say, in reality it is entirely accepted by the one side and entirely rejected by the other side. Affirmations and negations, but very few arguments, are exchanged, the sole motives for the acceptance of rejection of an idea being inevitably, for the immense majority of brains, mere sentimental motives, in which reasoning cannot have any part. Thanks to these always impassioned debates, the idea progresses slowly. The new generations who find it controverted tend to adopt it merely because it is controverted. For young persons always eager to be independent, wholesale opposition to received ideas is the most accessible form of originality. The idea continues then to gain ground, and before long it has no longer any need of support. It will now spread everywhere by the mere effect of imitation, acting as a contagion, a faculty with which men are generally endowed in as high a degree as are the big anthropoid apes, which modern science assigns to men as their forefathers. As soon as the mechanism of contagion intervenes, the idea enters on the phase which necessarily means success. It is soon accepted by opinion. It then acquires a penetrating and subtle force which spreads it progressively among all intellects, creating simultaneously a sort of special atmosphere, a general manner of thinking. Like the fine dust of the highway which penetrates everywhere, it finds its way into all the conceptions and all the productions of an epoch. The idea and its consequences then form part of that compact stock of hereditary commonplaces imposed on us by education. The idea has triumphed and has entered the domain of sentiment, where for long it will have nothing to fear. Of the various ideas which guide a civilization, some, those relating to the arts or philosophy for example, rest confined to the upper grades of the nation. Others, particularly those relating to religious conceptions and politics, go deep down in some instances among the crowd. They arrive there in general much deformed, but when they arrive there the power they exert over primitive minds incapable of reasoning is immense. The idea under these conditions represents something that is invincible, and its efforts are propagated with the violence of a torrent that has overflown its banks. It is always easy to find among a people 100,000 men ready to risk their lives to defend an idea as soon as this idea has subjugated them. Then it is that supervene those great events which revolutionize history, and which only crowds are capable of accomplishing. It is not men of letters, artists, or philosophers who establish the religions which have ruled the world, or the vast empires which have stretched from one hemisphere to another, or who have been the causes of the great religious and political revolutions which have changed the face of Europe. These achievements have been the work of the illiterate sufficiently dominated by an idea to sacrifice their lives to its propagation. With nothing else to rely on but this theoretically very insignificant, though practically very effective outfit, the nomads of the deserts of Arabia conquered a portion of the old Greco-Roman world and founded one of the most gigantic empires known to history. It was with a similar moral outfit, the domination of an idea, that the heroic soldiers of the Convention were victorious against the onslaughts of Europe up in arms. A strong conviction is so irresistible that only a conviction of equal strength has any chance of resisting it victoriously. Faith is the only serious enemy faith has to fear. It is sure to triumph where the material force opposed to it is in the service of weak sentiments and enfeebled beliefs. If, however, it finds itself confronted by a faith of equal intensity, the struggle becomes very severe, and success under these conditions is determined by accessory circumstances, most often of a moral order, by the spirit of discipline or the better organization. A close study of the history of the Arabs just referred to shows that on the occasion of their earlier conquests, and these conquests are always the most difficult and the most important, they encountered adversaries who were morally weak, although their military organization was fairly good. Syria was the first country they invaded. All they met there was Byzantine armies composed of mercenaries, but little disposed to sacrifice themselves for any cause whatever. Animated by an intense faith which increased their strength tenfold, they dispersed these troops who lacked an ideal as easily as before their time a handful of Greeks, sustained by love of their city, had dispersed the innumerable soldiers of Xerxes. The upshot of their enterprise would have been quite different if they had come into collision a few centuries earlier with the Roman cohorts. It is evident that when equally powerful moral forces are pitted against one another, victory rests with the side that is best organized. The faith of the Vendeans was assuredly most ardent. They were most energetically convinced, but the convictions of the soldiers of the convention were also very strong, and as their military organization was the better, they gained the day. In religion, as in politics, success always goes to those who believe, never to those who are sceptical. And if at the present day it would seem as if the future belongs to the socialists, in spite of the dangerous absurdity of their dogmas, the reason is that they are now the only party possessing real convictions. The modern governing classes have lost faith in everything. They no longer believe in anything, not even in the possibility of defending themselves against the threatening flood of barbarians by which they are surrounded on all sides. When an idea, after a longer or shorter period of tentative existence, modifications, deformations, discussion and propaganda, have acquired its definite form and penetrated the soul of the masses, it constitutes a dogma, that is, one of those absolute truths which are no longer discussed. It then forms part of those general beliefs on which the existence of peoples is based. Its universal character allows it to play a preponderating role. The great epochs of history, the century of Augustus or that of Louis XIV, have been those in which ideas, leaving their tentative period and getting beyond discussion, have taken fixed shape and become the sovereign masters of the thought of men. They then become brilliant beacons, and everything they illumine assumes a similar hue. As soon as a new idea has triumphed, it leaves its mark on all the elements of civilization, including the least important. But in order that it shall produce its full effect, it is necessary that it should have penetrated the soul of the masses. From the intellectual heights on which it came into being, it descends from grade to grade, undergoing on the way incessant alterations and modifications, until it has taken a shape in which it is accessible to the popular soul that is to secure its triumph. At this point it is met with concentrated in a very few words, sometimes in a single word, but this word evokes powerful images, either seductive or terrible, but always on this account impressive. Examples are the words paradise and hell in the Middle Ages, brief syllables which have the magic power of corresponding with everything, and for simple souls of explaining everything. The word socialism represents for the modern working man one of those magical and synthetic formulae capable of exerting an empire over souls. It evokes images which vary with the masses which it penetrates, but which are powerful in spite of their rudimentary forms. For the French theoretician, the word socialism evokes the image of a sort of paradise, in which men become equal, will enjoy ideal felicity under the incessant direction of the state. For the German working man, the image evoked presents itself under the guise of a smoky tavern, in which the government will serve gratuitously to every comer gigantic pyramids of sausages and sauerkraut and unlimited pots of beer. None among those who dream either of sauerkraut or of equality have ever, of course, been at pains to find out the sum total of what there is to be divided, or the number of those who are there to share it. The essential characteristic of an idea of this kind is that it assumes an absolute shape that raises it above all objection. When the idea has come to transform itself little by little into a sentiment, and has become a dogma, its triumph is assured for a long time, and all attempts to shake it by reasoning will be vain. Doubtless, in the end, the new idea will undergo the fate of the idea whose place it has taken. It will grow old and decline, but before it is completely used up it will have to undergo an entire series of retrograde transformations, of deformations of every kind, which will demand several generations for their accomplishment. Before dying out entirely, it will for long form part of those old hereditary ideas which we style prejudices, but which we nevertheless respect. An old idea, even though it has become a mere word, a sound, a mirage, possesses a magical power by which we are still subjugated. In this way is kept up that old inheritance of antiquated ideas, opinions, and conventions which we accept without demur, though they would offer but little resistance to an effort of the reason, if we would consent for an instant to discuss them. But how many men are capable of discussing their own opinions, and how many of these opinions would hold water after the most superficial examination? It is better that the redoubtable examination should not be attempted. Happily, there is little risk of our undertaking it, the critical spirit constituting a higher faculty that is very rare, whereas the spirit of imitation is a faculty very commonly possessed. The immense majority of minds accept without discussion the ready-made ideas furnished them by opinion and transmitted them by education. It thus happens that by means of heredity, education, surroundings, contagion, and opinion, the men of each age and of each race possess a sum of average conceptions which render them singularly like one another, alike indeed to such a degree that, when the lapse of centuries allows us to consider them from the proper perspective, we recognize by their artistic, philosophical, and literary productions the epoch at which they lived. Doubtless it could not be said that they copied one another absolutely, but as they had in common identical modes of feeling and thinking, they were necessarily led to produce very kindred work. We must congratulate ourselves that matters are thus arranged, for it is precisely this network of common traditions, ideas, sentiments, beliefs, and modes of thinking that form the soul of a people. We have seen that the vigour of the soul of a people is in proportion to the strength of this network. It is this network in reality, and it alone, that keeps nations alive, and it is impossible that it should break up without the nations crumbling away. It constitutes at once their true force and their true master. Asiatic sovereigns are sometimes represented as kinds of despots whose fantasy is their only guide. These fantasies, on the contrary, have singularly narrow limits. The network of traditions is more especially powerful in the East. Religious tradition, so enfeebled amongst ourselves, retain all their empire in the East, and the most whimsical despot would never run counter to two sovereigns he knows are infinitely more powerful than he is, tradition and opinion. The modern civilized man finds himself in one of those rare critical periods of history in which the old ideas whence his civilization is derived, having lost their empire, and the new ideas not being formed as yet, discussion is tolerated. He must go back to the periods of the civilizations of antiquity, or merely some 2 or 3 centuries back, to get an idea of the nature in those ages of the yoke of custom and opinion, and to learn the risks run by innovators sufficiently bold to attack these two powers. The Greeks, whom ignorant rhetoricians affirm to have been so free, were strictly subjected to the yoke of opinion and custom. Each citizen had a number of absolutely inviolable beliefs. None would have thought of discussing received ideas which were accepted without demur. The Grecian world was unacquainted with religious liberty, with the liberty of private life, or with liberties of any kind. The Athenian law did not even allow the citizen to keep aloof from the assemblies, or not to celebrate religiously a national fete. The alleged liberty of the ancient world was nothing but the unconscious and, in consequence, absolute form of the entire subjection of the citizen to the yoke of the ideas of his city. In the state of general war in which societies then lived, a society whose members should have possessed liberty of thought and action would not have lasted a single day. The age of decadence for gods, institutions, and dogmas has always begun as soon as they have been exposed to discussion. In modern civilizations, the old ideas which form the basis of custom and opinion having been almost destroyed, their empire over souls has become very weak. They have entered on that worn-out phase in which old ideas are in process of becoming prejudices. As long as they are not replaced by a new idea, anarchy reigns in men's minds. It is only thanks to this anarchy that discussion can be tolerated. Writers, thinkers, and philosophers sought to bless the present age and hasten to take advantage of it, for they will not see its like again. It is perhaps an age of decadence, but it is one of those rare moments in the history of the world during which expression of thought is free. It is impossible that it should last. Given the present conditions of civilization, the European peoples are tending towards a social state which will tolerate neither discussion nor liberty. The new dogmas that are about to come into being cannot establish themselves except on the condition that they accept no discussion of any kind, and that they be as intolerant as the dogmas that have preceded them. The man of the present day is still searching for the ideas that shall serve as the basis of the future social state, and therein lies the danger he runs. What is important in the history of peoples, and what has a far-reaching influence on their destiny, is neither revolutions nor wars. Their ruins are quickly effaced, but the changes in their fundamental ideas. They cannot be accomplished without all the elements of a civilization undergoing of necessity a simultaneous transformation. The real revolutions, the only revolutions that endanger the existence of a people, are those which affect its thought. It is not so much the adoption of new ideas that is dangerous for a people, as the trying of various ideas in succession to which it is condemned before it finds the idea on which it will be able to build up sufficiently solidly the new social edifice that is to replace the old. It is not assuredly because an idea is erroneous that it is dangerous. The religious ideas on which we have existed up to now were most erroneous, but it is because long repeated experiments are necessary to make it certain that the new ideas can be adapted to the needs of the societies that adopt them. The masses unhappily can only appreciate their degree of utility by dint of experience. Without doubt, there is no need to be a great psychologist or a great economist to predict that the application of existing socialist ideas will lead the peoples who adopt them to a state of abject decadence and shameful despotism. But how are the people it charms to be prevented from accepting the new gospel that is preached to them? History contains frequent examples of the cost of essaying ideas that are unacceptable for an epoch, but it is not to history that man goes for lessons. Charlemagne endeavoured in vain to re-establish the Roman Empire, but the idea of unity was not realizable at the time, and his work perished with him, as that of Napoleon was destined to perish at a later period. Philip II uselessly wasted his genius and the strength of Spain, the predominant country at the time, in an effort to combat the spirit of free inquiry which was spreading through Europe under the name of Protestantism. This opposition to the new idea merely resulted in reducing Spain to a state of ruin and decadence from which it has never recovered. In our own time, the chimerical ideas of a crowned visionary, inspired by the incurable international sentimentalism of his race, have brought about the unity of Italy and Germany, and have cost us 2 provinces while endangering the peace of Europe for a long time to come. The utterly false idea that numbers constitute the strength of armies has covered Europe with a sort of armed national guard, and is leading up to its inevitable bankruptcy. The socialist ideas with regard to labour, capital, the transformation of private property into state property, etc., will prove the destruction of the peoples that permanent armies and bankruptcy shall have spared. The principle of nationalities, formerly so dear to statesmen that they based their entire policy on it, may further be cited among the leading ideas whose dangerous influence has had to be undergone. Its realization has involved Europe in the most disastrous war, has armed it from one end to the other, and will land all modern states in succession in ruin and anarchy. The only apparent motive that could be invoked in defence of this principle was that the largest and most populous countries are the strongest, and run the fewest risks. It was secretly reflected that they were the best fitted to embark on conquest. It is found, however, today that it is precisely the smallest and least populous countries, Portugal, Greece, Switzerland, Belgium, Sweden, the petty Balkan principalities, that have the least to fear from their neighbours. The idea of unity has so completely ruined Italy, formerly so prosperous, that it is on the eve of a revolution and of bankruptcy. The annual budgetary expenditure of all the Italian states, which before the realization of Italian unity amounted to 550 millions, now reaches 2 milliards. It is not given, however, to men to stop the march of ideas when they have penetrated the soul of the masses. When they have done this, their evolution must be accomplished, and it often happens that they are defended by those who will be their first victims. It is not sheep merely that docilely follow their guide to the slaughterhouse. We must bow before the strength of an idea. When it has attained to a certain period of its evolution, there are no longer either arguments or demonstrations that can avail against it. For peoples to be able to free themselves from the yoke of an idea, either centuries or violent revolutions are necessary, sometimes the two. Innumerable are the chimeras humanity has forged for itself, and of which in succession it has been the victim. Chapter 2. The role of religious beliefs in the evolution of civilizations. Preponderating influence of religious ideas. They have always constituted the most important elements of the life of peoples. Religious ideas responsible for the majority of historical events and social and political institutions. A new civilization always comes into existence with a new religious idea. Power of the religious ideal, its influence on character. It directs all the faculties towards the same end. The political, artistic, and literary history of peoples is the offspring of their beliefs. The slightest change in the state of a people's belief results in an entire series of transformations in its existence. Various examples. Among the various ideas by which the peoples have been guided, the ideas which are the beacons of history, the poles of civilization, religious ideas, have played too preponderating and too fundamental a part for us not to devote a special chapter to them. Religious beliefs have always constituted the most important element of the life of peoples, and in consequence of their history. The most considerable historical events, those which have had the most colossal influence, have been the birth and death of gods. With a new religious idea, a new civilization is born into the world. At all the ages of humanity, in ancient times as in modern times, the fundamental questions have always been religious questions. If humanity could allow all its gods to die, it might be said of such an event that, as regards its consequences, it would be the most important event that had taken place on the surface of our planet since the birth of the first civilizations. For it must not be forgotten that, since the dawn of historical times, all political and social institutions have been founded on religious beliefs, and that the gods have always played the first role on the world's stage. Apart from love, which itself is a powerful but personal and transitory religion, it is only religious beliefs that are capable of influencing character in a rapid manner. The conquests of the Arabs, the Crusades, Spain under the Inquisition, England during the Puritan period, France with its Saint Bartholomew, and the wars of the Revolution show what becomes of a people rendered fanatic by its chimeras. These chimeras exercise a sort of permanent hypnotic effect, which is so intense that it profoundly transforms the entire mental constitution. Doubtless it is man who created the gods, but after having created them he promptly became their slave. They are not the offspring of fear, as Lucretius affirms, but of hope, and for this reason their influence will be eternal. The gift of the gods to man, and it is a gift which they alone have been able to endow him with up to now, is a state of mind which allows of happiness. No philosophy has ever been able as yet to realize such an achievement. The consequence, if not the aim, of all civilizations, of all philosophies, of all religions, is to engender certain states of mind. But of these states of mind, some imply happiness while the others do not. Happiness depends very little on exterior circumstances, and to a very great extent on our disposition of spirit. The martyrs at the stake were probably much happier than their executioners. The street sweeper who, devoid of care, eats his crust of bread rubbed with garlic may be infinitely happier than the millionaire who is a prey to manifold anxieties. The evolution of civilization has unhappily created for the modern man a multitude of wants, without giving him the means of satisfying them, and in this way has promoted general discontent. Civilization is doubtless the mother of progress, but it is the mother as well of socialism and anarchism, those redoubtable expressions of the despair of the masses that are no longer sustained by any belief. Compare the restless, feverish European discontented with his lot, with the Oriental always satisfied with his destiny. In what do they differ, if not as regards the state of their soul? A people has been transformed when its mode of conceiving and in consequence of thinking and acting has been transformed. Under penalty of being unable to last for long, the primary duty of a society is to endeavour to find the means of creating a state of mind which shall render man happy. All the societies founded up to the present have had as their basis an ideal capable of subjugating men's souls, and they have always disappeared as soon as this ideal has ceased to subjugate them. One of the great errors of modern times is the belief that it is only in exterior things that the human soul can find happiness. Happiness is within us, created by ourselves, and scarcely ever outside ourselves. After having destroyed the ideals of past ages, we are now finding that it is not possible to live without them, and that the secret of replacing them must be discovered if we would continue to exist. The true benefactors of humanity, those who merit colossal statues in gold raised in their honour by grateful peoples, are those powerful magicians, the creators of ideals, whom humanity sometimes produces, but whom it produces so rarely. Above the torrent of vain appearances, standing forth the only realities man can ever know, above the inexorable, the glacial mechanism of the world, they have evoked powerful and pacifying chimeras, which hide from man the sombre ideas of his destiny, and create for him enchanted refuges of dreams and hope. From the exclusively political standpoint, too, it is found that the influence of religious beliefs is immense. What makes their irresistible force is that they constitute the only factor which can momentarily procure a people absolute community of interests, sentiments, and thoughts. In this way the religious spirit replaces at one stroke the low hereditary accumulation necessary to form the soul of a nation. The people that is subjected by a belief does not doubtless change its mental constitution, but all its faculties are directed towards the same end, the triumph of its belief, and solely in virtue of this fact its strength becomes formidable. It is at epochs of ardent faith that peoples momentarily transformed accomplish those prodigious efforts, found those empires which are the astonishment of history. It was thus that a few Arab tribes, unified by the thought of Mahomet, conquered in a few years nations who ignored their very names and founded their immense empire. It is not the quality of the beliefs that must be taken into consideration, but the sway they exert over men's souls. Whether the god invoked be Moloch or some other yet more barbarous divinity is of no importance. It is even well for the prestige of the divinity that it should be wholly intolerant and barbarous. Gods too tolerant or too mild lend their worshippers no strength. The sectaries of the stern Mahomet ruled for long over a great portion of the world, and are still redoubtable. Those of pacific Buddha have never founded anything durable, and are already forgotten by history. The religious spirit, then, has played a political role of capital importance in the existence of peoples, because it was always the only factor capable of influencing their character in a short space of time. The gods, no doubt, are not immortal, but the religious spirit is eternal. It may slumber for a while, but it awakes as soon as a new divinity is created. A century ago it enabled France to resist victoriously the onslaughts of all Europe up in arms. Once more the world has had the spectacle of what may be accomplished by the religious spirit, for it was indeed a new religion that was founded at the period in question, and that inspired an entire people. The divinities that blossomed forth were doubtless too fragile to last, but so long as they lasted they exerted absolute sway. The power of transforming souls possessed by religions is, however, somewhat ephemeral. It is rare for beliefs to retain for any length of time that degree of intensity which entirely transforms character. The dream ends by growing more shadowy. The hypnotized people awakes in a measure, and the old substratum of character again comes to the front. Even in cases where the beliefs are all powerful, the national character is always recognizable in the manner in which these beliefs are adopted and in the manifestations they provoke. What differences there are between the same belief as found in England, Spain, or France! Would the Reformation ever have been possible in Spain, or would England ever have consented to submit to the terrible yoke of the Inquisition? Among the peoples who have adopted the Reformed faith, is it not easy to perceive the fundamental characteristics of races which, in spite of the hypnotizing action of their beliefs, have preserved the special features of their mental constitution: independence, energy, the habit of reasoning, and of not obeying servilely the law of a master? The political, artistic, and literary history of peoples is the offspring of their beliefs. But these latter, while they modify the character, are also profoundly modified by it. The character of a people and its beliefs are the keys of its destiny. The former, as regards its fundamental elements, is invariable, and it is precisely because it does not vary that the history of a people always retains a certain unity. The beliefs, on the other hand, may vary, and it is because they vary that history records so many upheavals. The slightest change in the state of a people's beliefs necessarily results in an entire series of transformations in its existence. We remarked in a previous chapter that in France the men of the 18th century seemed very different from those of the 17th century. Doubtless, but what was the origin of this difference? Solely the fact that in the lapse of a century theology had given way to science, reason had taken the place of tradition, and observed truth that of revealed truth. By this simple change of conceptions the aspect of a century is transformed, and were we to follow its effects, we should find that our great revolution, together with the events that have since occurred and are still in progress, are the mere consequence of an evolution of religious ideas. Moreover, if at the present day our old society totters on its foundations and finds all its institutions profoundly shaken, the reason is that it is losing more and more the beliefs on which it had existed up till now. When it shall have lost them entirely, a new civilization, founded on a new faith, will necessarily take its place. History shows us that people do not long survive the disappearance of their gods. The civilizations that are born with them also die with them. There is nothing so destructive as the dust of dead gods. Chapter 3. The role of great men in the history of peoples. The great advances made by each civilization have always been realized by a small elite of superior minds. Nature of their role. They synthesize all the efforts of a race. Examples supplied by great discoveries. Political role of great men. They embody the dominant ideal of their race. Influence of the great hallucinated. Inventors of genius transform a civilization. The fanatics and the hallucinated make history. When studying the hierarchy and the differentiation of races, we saw that what most differentiates Europeans from Orientals is that only the former possess an elite of superior men. Let us now endeavour to trace in a few lines the limits of the role of this elite. The small phalanx of eminent men possessed by a civilized people, a phalanx it would suffice to suppress in each generation to lower considerably the intellectual level of that people, constitutes the true incarnation of the forces of a race. To it is due the progress realized in the sciences, the arts, in industry, in a word, in all the branches of civilization. History shows that it is to this circumscribed elite that we owe all the advances made. Although they profit by these advances, the masses do not like being surpassed, and the greatest thinkers and inventors have often been their martyrs. And yet all the generations, all the past of a race, blossom forth in these splendid geniuses, which are the marvellous flowers of a race. They are the true glory of a nation, each member of which, down to the most humble, is entitled to be proud of them. They do not appear by chance or by a miracle, but represent the crowning point of a long past. They synthesize the greatness of their time and of their race. To favour their production and development is to favour the achievement of those advances of which humanity will reap the benefit. If we allow ourselves to be too much blinded by our dreams of universal equality, we shall be the first victims of our attitude. Equality carries inferiority in its wake. It is the dull, oppressive dream of vulgar mediocrities. It has only been realized in barbarous epochs. For equality to reign in the world, it would be necessary to bring down, little by little, whatever makes the value of a race to the level of what is least elevated in the race. But while the role of superior men in the development of a civilization is considerable, it is not, however, quite what it is generally said to be. Their action consists, I repeat, in synthesizing all the efforts of a race. Their discoveries are always the result of a long series of anterior discoveries. They build an edifice with the stones which others have slowly hewn. Historians, who in general are very simple-minded, have always thought it right to connect the name of a man with each invention. And yet, of the great inventions which have transformed the world, such as printing, gunpowder, steam, or the electric telegraph, there is not one of which it can be said that it was created by a single brain. When the genesis of discoveries of this kind are studied, it is always found that they are the outcome of a long series of preparatory efforts. The final invention is only the crowning stroke. Galileo's observation of the isochronism of the oscillations of a suspended lamp paved the way for the invention of chronometers, which were to enable sailors to trace their route across the ocean with certainty. Gunpowder resulted from the slow transformations of Grecian fire. The steam engine represents the sum of a series of inventions, each of which demanded immense labor. A Greek, had he had 100 times as much genius as Archimedes, would have been unable to discover the locomotive engine. Could he have discovered it, moreover, the discovery would have been of no use to him, as to fabricate his engine he would have had to wait until mechanics had realized advances which it took 2,000 years of efforts to achieve. The political role of great statesmen, while it is apparently more independent of the past, is nevertheless scarcely less dependent thereon than is the role of great inventors. Blinded by the dazzling brilliancy of the powerful leaders of men who have transformed the political existence of peoples, such writers as Hegel, Cousin, Carlyle, etc., have wished to make of them demigods, whose unaided genius has modified the destiny of peoples. Beyond doubt they can affect the evolution of a society, but it is not given to them to change its course. The genius of a Cromwell or a Napoleon is powerless to achieve such a task. Great conquerors can destroy towns, men, and empires by fire and sword, as a child can set fire to a museum filled with art treasures. But this destructive power must not deceive us as to the nature of their role. The influence of great politicians is only durable when, as in the case of Caesar or Richelieu, they contrive to give their efforts a direction in harmony with the needs of the moment. The true cause of their success is generally much anterior to themselves. Had he made the attempt 2 or 3 centuries earlier, Caesar would not have made the great Roman Republic accept the law of a master, and under the same conditions Richelieu would have been unable to realize the unity of France. In politics, the really great men are those who have a presentiment of the needs that are about to arise, of the events for which the past has paved the way, and who show their fellows the direction that has got to be taken. This direction perhaps was clear to nobody, but the fatalities of evolution were soon to engage therein the peoples whose destinies were momentarily in the hands of these powerful geniuses. They, too, like the great inventors, synthesize the result of a long anterior evolution. These analogies between the different categories of great men must not be carried too far. The inventors play an important part in the future evolution of a civilization, but no immediate role in the political history of peoples. The superior men to whom are due the important discoveries from the plough to the telegraph, which are the common patrimony of humanity, have never possessed the qualities of character requisite for the founding of a religion or the conquest of an empire, necessary, that is, to change visibly the face of history. The thinker is too alive to the complexity of problems ever to have very strong convictions, and too few political ends seem to him worthy of his efforts for him to attempt to realize any one of them. Inventors may modify a civilization in the long run. It is only fanatics, men of narrow intelligence but energetic character and powerful passions, who are capable of founding religions and empires. At the bidding of a Peter the Hermit, millions of men hurled themselves against the East. The words of an hallucinated enthusiast such as Mohammed created a force capable of triumphing over the old Greco-Roman world. An obscure monk like Luther bathed Europe in blood. The voice of a Galileo or a Newton will never have the least echo among the masses. The inventors of genius hasten the march of civilization. The fanatics and the hallucinated create history. For of what is history, as written in books, composed, if not of the long narrative of man's struggles to create an ideal, to worship it, and then to destroy it? And in the eyes of science, have such ideals more value than the vain mirages created by the action of light on the moving sands of the desert? Still, it is the hallucinated, the creators or propagators of these mirages, who have effected the most far-reaching transformations in the world. From the depth of their tombs they still inflict the yoke of their thoughts on the soul of races, and influence the character and destiny of peoples. The importance of their role must not be overlooked, but at the same time it must not be forgotten that the task they accomplished was successfully accomplished because they unconsciously embodied and expressed the ideal of their race and their epoch. A people is only led by those who embody its dreams. Moses represented for the Jews the desire for deliverance over which they had brooded during the years that they were slaves lacerated by the whips of the Egyptians. Buddha and Jesus were alive to the infinite miseries of their time, and gave a religious shape to the need for charity and pity, which at these periods of universal suffering were coming into existence in the world. Mohammed realized by means of unity of belief the political unity of a people divided into thousands of rival tribes. That soldier of genius, Napoleon, embodied the ideal of military glory, of vanity, and of revolutionary propaganda, which at the time were the characteristics of the people he led all over Europe during 15 years in pursuit of wild adventures. At bottom, then, it is ideas, and in consequence those who embody and propagate them, that rule the world. Their triumph is assured when they are defended by the hallucinated and by enthusiasts. It is of slight importance whether they be true or false. History ever teaches us that it is the most chimerical ideas that have had the most fanatical following and played the most important role. It is in the name of the most illusory chimeras that the world has been hitherto thrown into confusion, that civilizations which seemed imperishable have been destroyed, and that others have been founded. It is not, as the gospel assures us, the kingdom of heaven, but of the earth, that belongs to the poor in spirit, only provided they possess the faith that moves mountains. Philosophers, who often have to devote centuries to destroying what enthusiasts have created in a day, ought to bow before those who are capable of such feats. The enthusiasts form part of the mysterious forces that shape the world. They have determined the most important of the events of which history records the course. Doubtless they have only propagated illusions, but it is on these illusions, at once redoubtable, seductive, and vain, that humanity has hitherto existed, and doubtless will continue to exist. These illusions are mere shadows, but they must nevertheless be respected. Thanks to them, our forefathers knew what hope was, and in their heroic and wild pursuit of these shadows, they raised us from our primitive state of barbarism to the point we have reached today. Of all the factors in the development of civilizations, illusions are perhaps the most powerful. It was an illusion that built up the pyramids and covered Egypt for 5,000 years with colossal stone monuments. It was an illusion that in the Middle Ages raised our gigantic cathedrals and induced the Western world to dispute the possession of a tomb with the East. It is the pursuit of illusions that has founded the religions which exert their sway over half of humanity, and founded or destroyed the vastest empires. It is not in the pursuit of truth, but in that of error, that humanity has expended the most efforts. It could not attain the chimerical goals it had in view, but it was in trying to attain them that it realized all the progress it had no thought of achieving. How civilizations fade away and die out. Dissolution of psychological species. How hereditary dispositions which had required centuries for their formation may be rapidly lost. A very long time is always necessary for a people to raise itself to a high level of civilization. and in some cases a very short time for it to descend therefrom. The principal factors in the decadence of a people is the lowering of its character. The mechanism of the dissolution of civilizations has hitherto been the same for all peoples. Symptoms of decadence presented by some Latin peoples: development of egoism, diminution of initiative and willpower, lowering of character and morality. The youth of the present day, probable influence of socialism, its dangers and its strength, how it will cause the civilizations that undergo it to return to wholly barbarous forms of evolution, the peoples among whom it will be able to triumph. Psychological species are not eternal any more than are anatomical species. The conditions of environment which maintain the fixity of their characteristics do not last forever. If the environment is modified, the elements of the mental constitution which it has determined end by undergoing retrograde transformations, which lead up to their disappearance. In accordance with physiological laws, as applicable to the cells of the brain as to those of the body, are observed in all beings. The organs take infinitely less time to disappear than was required for their formation. Every organ that does not fulfill its function soon ceases to be able to fulfill it. The eyes of fish that live in the lakes of caverns lose the power of sight after a time, and this infirmity ends by becoming hereditary. Indeed, even if observation be confined to the brief life of the individual, an organ that has perhaps demanded thousands of centuries for its formation by slow adaptations and hereditary accumulations is rapidly stricken with atrophy when it ceases to be used. The mental constitution of beings cannot escape these physiological laws. The brain cell that is not utilized ceases to fulfill its functions, and mental dispositions it took centuries to form may be promptly lost. Courage, initiative, energy, the spirit of enterprise, and various qualities of character that were a long time in being acquired disappear quickly enough when they cease to be exercised. This fact explains how it is that a people always requires a very long time to raise itself to a high level of culture, and in some cases a very short time to descend into the abyss of decadence. When the causes are examined that led to the successive ruin of the various peoples with which history is concerned, whether the people in question be the Persians, the Romans, or any other nation, the fundamental factor in their fall is always found to be a change in their mental constitution resulting from the deterioration of their character. I cannot call to mind a single people that has disappeared in consequence of the deterioration of its intelligence. For all the civilizations of the past, the mechanism of dissolution has been identical. So identical, indeed, that it may be asked with the poet whether history, which has so many books, has but a single page. When a people reaches that degree of civilization and power at which it is assured that it is no longer exposed to the attacks of its neighbours, it begins to enjoy the benefits of peace and material well-being procured by wealth. At this juncture the military virtues decline, the excess of civilization creates new needs, and egoism increases. Having no ideal beyond the hasty enjoyment of rapidly acquired advantages, the citizens abandon to the state the care of public affairs, and soon lose all the qualities that had made their greatness. Then barbarian or semi-barbarian neighbours whose needs are few, but who are strongly attached to an ideal, invade the too civilized people, and proceed to form a new civilization with the debris of that which they have overthrown. It was in this way that, in spite of the formidable organizations of the Romans and the Persians, the barbarians destroyed the empire of the former and the Arabs that of the latter. It was not in the qualities appertaining to the intelligence that the invaded peoples were lacking. From this point of view, no comparison was possible between the conquerors and the conquered. It was when Rome already bore within it the germs of its approaching decadence that it counted the greatest number of men of culture, artists, men of letters, and men of learning. Almost all the works that have made its greatness date from this period of its history. But Rome had lost that fundamental element which no development of the intelligence can replace, character. Footnote. Quote, "The evil from which Roman society was then suffering," unquote, writes M. Fostel de Coulanges, quote, "was not the corruption of the morals, it was the weakening of its will power, and, so to speak, the enervation of its character." Unquote. End of footnote. The old-time Romans had very few wants and a very strong ideal. This ideal, the greatness of Rome, absolutely dominated their souls, and each citizen was ready to sacrifice to it his family, his fortune, and his life. When Rome had become the pole of the universe, the richest city of the world, it was invaded by foreigners hailing from all countries, and whom it admitted in the end to rights of citizenship. As all they demanded was to be allowed to enjoy the luxury of Rome, they had but little concern for its glory. The great city then became an immense caravansary, but was no longer Rome. It seemed to be still alive, but its soul had long been dead. Analogous causes of decadence threaten our hyper-refined civilizations, which are menaced, however, as well by other causes due to the evolution produced in men's minds by modern scientific discoveries. Science has renewed our ideas and deprived our religious and social conceptions of all authority. It has shown man the trifling place he occupies in the universe and the utter indifference of nature towards him. He has perceived that what he used to term liberty was merely ignorance of the causes of which he is the slave, and that, in view of the inexorable necessities of which they are the puppets, to be slaves is the natural condition of all living beings. He has learned that nature ignores what we term pity, and that all the progress it has realized has been due to a pitiless process of selection that involves the perpetual crushing of the weak by the strong. All these harsh and glacial conceptions, so contrary to the teachings of the old beliefs that enchanted our forefathers, have given birth to ominous conflicts in men's souls. In vulgar brains they have engendered that state of anarchy as regards his ideas which seems characteristic of the modern man. In the case of the young generation of artists and men of letters, these same conflicts have resulted in a sort of sullen indifference that is fatal to the will, in an utter incapacity to embrace any cause whatever with enthusiasm, and in an exclusive cult of immediate and personal interests. Commenting upon a very just reflection of a modern writer to the effect that the quote, "sense of the relative dominates contemporary thought," unquote, a minister of public instruction proclaimed with evident satisfaction in a recent speech that quote, "the substitution of relative ideas for abstract notions in every field of human knowledge is the greatest conquest of science," unquote. The conquest declared to be new is in reality very old. It was achieved many centuries ago by the philosophers of India. Let us not be too ready to congratulate ourselves that it is tending at the present day to gain ground. The real danger to modern societies lies precisely in the fact that men have lost confidence in the worth of the principles that serve as their foundations. I greatly doubt whether it would be possible to cite in all history a single civilization, a single institution, a single belief that has succeeded in holding its own by taking its stand on principles esteemed to have only a relative value. Moreover, if the future seems to belong to those socialist doctrines which reason condemns, it is because they are the only doctrines whose upholders speak in the name of truths they declare to be absolute. The masses will always turn towards those who speak to them of absolute truths, and will slight all others. To be a statesman, it is necessary to be able to penetrate the soul of the multitude, to understand its dreams, and to renounce philosophic abstractions. Things in themselves change but little. It is only the ideas that are formed of them that change greatly. It is on these ideas that it is needful to know how to act. Doubtless our knowledge of the real world is limited to appearances, to mere states of conscience of which the value is evidently relative. But when we adopt the social standpoint, we can say that for a given age and a given society there are conditions of existence, moral laws and institutions which have an absolute value, since the society in question could not subsist without them. As soon as this value is called in question, or doubt enters men's minds, the society is condemned to an early death. The truths just enunciated may be inculcated without fear, for they are among those which no science can contest. Contrary language can only bring about the most disastrous consequences. The philosophic nihilism propagated at the present day by authorized voices among weak minds induces them to believe at once in the absolute injustice of our social system and in the absurdity of all monarchies, inspires them with a hatred of all that exists, and leads them directly to socialism and anarchism. Modern statesmen are too persuaded of the influence of institutions and too little of the influence of ideas, and yet science shows them that the former are always the offspring of the latter, and have never been able to subsist without leaning on them as a foundation. Ideas represent the invisible springs of things. When they have disappeared, the underlying supports of constitutions and civilizations are destroyed. It was always a redoubtable moment for a people when its old ideas descended into the sombre necropolis where the dead gods repose. Going on from the causes to study the effects, it has to be admitted that visible decadence seriously threatens the vitality of the majority of the great European nations, and especially of those known as the Latin nations, and really Latin nations if not as regards their blood, at least as regards their traditions and education. Every day they are losing their initiative, their energy, their will, and their capacity to act. The satisfaction of perpetually growing material wants tends to become their sole ideal. The family is breaking up. The social springs are strained. Discontent and unrest are spreading to all classes, from the richest to the poorest. Like the ship that has lost its compass and strays as chance and the winds direct, the modern man wanders at haphazard through the spaces formerly peopled by the gods and rendered a desert by science. He has lost his faith, and with it his hopes. The masses, grown excessively impressionable and changeable, and no longer kept in check by any barrier, seem fated to oscillate without intermission between the wildest anarchy and the most oppressive despotism. Words will turn their heads, but their divinities of a day are soon their victims. In appearance they seem ardently to desire liberty. In reality they will have none of it, and they are incessantly appealing to the state to forge them chains. They yield blind obedience to the obscurest sectaries, to the most narrow-minded despots. The rhetoricians who imagine they lead the masses, but who most often follow them, confound the impatience and nervousness that find vent in an incessant desire for a change of master, with the true spirit of independence that girds against any master whatever. The state, whatever be the nominal regime, is the divinity towards which all parties turn. It is the state that is appealed to for regulations and protection, every day more oppressive, that surround the most trivial acts of existence with the most Byzantine and tyrannical formalities. The younger generations are more and more disposed to renounce careers demanding judgment, initiative, energy, personal effort, and will. The slightest responsibility alarms them. They are content with the mediocre prospects offered them by state-paid employment. The commercial classes ignore the colonies, which are solely peopled by functionaries. Footnote. In a speech pronounced in the Chamber on Deputies on November 27, 1890, by M. Etienne, at the time Under Secretary for the Colonies, I note the following very characteristic passage, which I borrow from the newspaper Le Cycle. Quote, Cochin China has 1,800,000 inhabitants. Of this number, 1,600 are Frenchmen, 1,200 of whom are functionaries. The country is administered by a colonial council elected by these 1,200 functionaries. It has a deputy, and you are surprised that anarchy reigns in the country! Exclamation and laughter on a great number of benches. Quote, Are you aware what is the outcome of such a system? Its outcome is this phenomenon, that 9 millions out of a budget reduced to 22 millions is absorbed by the expenses in connection with the functionaries. Quote, Yes, in 1877 I tried to reduce the number of functionaries. I reduced the expenses by 3,500,000 francs out of a total of 9 millions. I took this measure in the month of October. In December the cabinet of which I was a member was overthrown, and in the following March the functionaries I had suppressed were reinstated." End of footnote. Energy and action have been replaced among statesmen by terribly empty personal discussions, in the case of the masses by passing enthusiasms or hatreds, in the case of men of letters by a sort of tearful, vague, and unfruitful sentimentalism, and by colourless dissertations on the miseries of existence. A boundless egoism is developing on all sides. The individual is coming to be solely preoccupied with himself. Consciences are capitulating and morality is deteriorating and gradually dying out. Footnote. This lowering of morality is serious when observed in professions such as the magistracy and the profession of notary, in which honesty used to be as general as courage among soldiers. As regards the notaries, morality has at present descended to a very low level. The official statisticians affirm, "that among the notaries there is a proportion of 43 accused persons out of 10,000 individuals, whereas the average for the whole population of France is 1 accused person for the same number of individuals." In a report addressed to the President of the Republic by the Minister of Justice and published in the Journal Officiel, January 31st, 1890, I find the following passage. "The disasters which as early as 1840 had begun to inspire the public with uneasiness increased progressively to such a degree that in 1876 one of my predecessors had to call the special attention of the magistrates to the situation of the notaries. The dismissal of notaries and notarial catastrophes were occurring with unaccustomed frequency and under circumstances of great gravity. The number of disasters rose successively from 31 in 1882 to 41 in 1883 to 54 in 1884 to 71 in 1886, and the total embezzlements committed by notaries amounted to 62 million francs for the period between 1880 and 1886. Finally, in 1889, 103 notaries were dismissed or obliged to give up their practice." If we connect with these facts the successive ruin of our most important financial enterprises, the Comtoir d'Escompte, the Dépôt et Comptes Courants, Panama, etc., it can only be admitted that the invectives of the socialists against the morality of the leading classes are not without foundation. The same symptoms of demoralization are unfortunately to be observed among all the Latin peoples. The scandal of the Italian state banks, in which robbery was practised on an immense scale by politicians of the foremost rank, the bankruptcy of Portugal, the wretched financial situation of Spain and Italy, the profound decadence of the Latin republics of America, prove that the character and morality of certain peoples have sustained incurable injury, and that their rôle in the world is nearly at an end. The individual is losing all empire over himself. He can no longer govern himself, and the man who cannot govern himself must inevitably come before long to be governed by others. To change all this would be a hard task. It would be necessary to change first of all our lamentable Latin education. It is fatal to any initiative and energy that heredity may have spared. It extinguishes every gleam of intellectual independence by giving young people as their sole ideal hateful examinations, which, as they only demand efforts of the memory, place in the front rank of our professions intelligences whose servile aptitude for imitation is the negation of all individuality and all personal efforts. "I try to pour iron into the soul of my pupils," said an English schoolmaster to Guizot when he was visiting the schools of Great Britain. Where among the Latin nations are the schoolmasters or the programs capable of realizing such an ambition? The military regime will perhaps realize it. In any case, it is the sole educator that is capable of realizing it. One of the principal conditions of improvement for decadent peoples is the organization of a very severe universal military service and the permanent menace of disastrous wars. It is to this general lowering of character, to the powerlessness of the citizens to govern themselves, and to the egotistic indifference that is more especially due the difficulty experienced by the majority of the Latin peoples in living under liberal laws as far removed from despotism as from anarchy. It is easily understandable that such laws should be little to the liking of the masses, for Caesarism holds out to them the promise, if not of liberty, on which they do not set much store, at any rate, of a very considerable measure of equality in servitude. On the other hand, it would be incomprehensible that republican institutions should encounter most opposition from the enlightened classes, but for the necessity of taking into account the weight of ancestral influences. Is it not without such institutions that all forms of superiority, and intellectual superiority in particular, have most chance of being able to display themselves? It might even be said that the only real objection to such institutions, from the point of view of those who stand out for equality at any price, is the fact that they favour the formation of powerful intellectual aristocracies. The most oppressive of regimes, on the contrary, both for character and for the intelligence, is Caesarian in its various forms. All that can be said for it is that it facilitates equality in degradation and humility in servitude. It is well adapted to the inferior minds of decadent peoples, and that is why they always revert to it as soon as they are able. The plume of the first general that comes along will be made the excuse for its adoption. When a people has reached this pass, its hour has struck, its destiny is accomplished. At the present hour, this old-time Caesarian, which history has always seen appear at the earliest dawn of civilizations and at their extreme decadence, is undergoing a manifest evolution. Today we are witnessing its resurrection under the name of socialism. This new expression of state absolutism will assuredly be the most grievous form of Caesarism, because being impersonal, it will escape all the motives of fear that keep the worst tyrants under restraint. Socialism appears today to be the gravest of the dangers that threaten the European peoples. It will doubtless complete a decadence for which many causes are paving the way, and it will perhaps mark the end of Western civilization. To appreciate its dangers and its strengths, it is not the teachings it spreads abroad that must be considered, but the devotion it inspires. Socialism will soon constitute the new faith of the suffering masses, whose existence is often and inevitably rendered far from enviable by the economic conditions of contemporary civilization. It will be the new religion that will people the empty heavens. For all the human creatures who cannot support misery unrelieved by illusion, this religion will replace the luminous paradise of which the painted windows of the churches spoke to them in the past. This great religious entity of tomorrow sees the crowd of its faithful increase every day. It will soon have its martyrs, and it will then become one of those religious creeds which stir up peoples and whose power over souls is absolute. That the dogmas of socialism lead to a regime of degrading slavery, which will destroy all initiative and all independence in the souls bowed beneath its empire, is doubtless evident, but only by psychologists acquainted with the condition of man's existence. Such foresight is beyond the reach of the masses. They require arguments of a different order to persuade them, and these arguments have never been furnished by reason. That the new dogmas we see coming into being are contrary to the most elementary good sense is also evident. But were not the religious dogmas that have guided men during so many centuries also contrary to good sense, and has the fact hindered them from subjecting the most luminous geniuses to their laws? In the matter of his beliefs, man only hearkens to the unconscious voice of his sentiments. They form an obscure domain from which reason has always been excluded. In consequence, and by the mere fact of the mental constitution created them by a long past, the peoples of Europe will be obliged to undergo the redoubtable phase of socialism. It will be the signal for their entry on one of the last stages of decadence. By causing civilization to revert to wholly inferior forms of evolution, it will facilitate the destructive invasions by which we are threatened. Outside Russia, whose population from the psychological point of view is much more Asiatic than European, the English would seem to be almost the only race in Europe possessing sufficient energy, stable enough beliefs, and a sufficiently independent character to avoid succumbing to the new religion, the birth of which we are witnessing. Modern Germany, in spite of deceptive appearances of prosperity, will doubtless be its first victim, judging from the success of the various sects that abound within its frontiers. The socialism that will prove its ruin will doubtless be couched in strictly scientific formulae, of value at the best for an ideal society such as humanity will never produce. But this latest child of pure reason will be more intolerant and more redoubtable than all its elders. No people is so well prepared as Germany to accept its yoke. No people of the present age has more entirely lost its initiative, its independence, and the habit of self-government. The most eminent German writers are perfectly agreed on this point. In his recent book on the social questions, Herr T. Ziegler, professor at the University of Strasbourg, expresses himself as follows, while self-help is the dominant tendency in England, recourse to the state is the characteristic of Germany. We are a people that for centuries has been accustomed to be under a guardian. Moreover, during the last 20 years, the strong arm of Bismarck, by assuring us security, has caused us to lose the sentiment of responsibility and initiative. It is for this reason that in difficult and even in easy cases we appeal for the aid and protection of the state and abandon ourselves to its initiative." As to Russia, it has evolved too recently from the regime of the "Mir," that is to say, from primitive communism, the most perfect form of socialism, to return to this inferior stage of evolution. It has other destinies. It is doubtless Russia that will one day furnish the irresistible flood of barbarians destined to destroy the old civilizations of the West, whose end will have been led up to by economic struggles and socialism. This hour, however, has not struck as yet. To reach it we have still to traverse certain phases. Socialism will be too oppressive a regime to last. It will make people regret the age of Tiberius and Caligula, and will bring back that age. One sometimes asks how the Romans of the time of the emperors so easily supported the wild ferocity of certain despots. The reason is that they too had traversed social struggles, civil wars and proscriptions, and the experience had cost them their character. They had come to consider these tyrants as the ultimate instruments of their salvation. They put up with everything from them because they did not know how to replace them. The truth is they cannot be replaced. After them came the final catastrophe, brought about by the barbarians. History always turns in the same circle. General conclusions. We have already remarked in the introduction to this work that it was merely a short summary, a sort of synthesis of the volumes we have devoted to the history of civilizations. Each of the chapters composing it should be regarded as the conclusion arrived at by anterior investigations. It is very difficult in consequence to still further condense ideas so condensed already. I shall attempt, however, for the benefit of readers whose time is precious, to present in the guise of very brief propositions the fundamental principles which represent the philosophy of this work. A race possesses psychological characteristics almost as fixed as its physical characteristics. Like the anatomic species, the psychological species is only transformed as the result of the accumulations of ages. To the fixed and hereditary psychological characteristics, whose association forms the mental constitution of a race, are adjoined, as in the case of all anatomic species, accessory elements created by diverse modifications of the environment. Being incessantly renewed, they endow a race with a certain measure of apparent variability. The mental constitution of a race represents not only the synthesis of the living beings which compose it, but more particularly that of all the ancestors who have contributed to its formation. It is not the living but the dead who play the preponderating role in the existence of a people. They are the creators of its morality and the unconscious sources of its conduct. The very great anatomic differences which distinguish the various human races are accompanied by not less considerable psychological differences. When only the average representatives of each race are compared, the mental differences often appear somewhat slight. They become immense as soon as the comparison is instituted between the most elevated elements of each race. It is then found that what more especially differentiates superior from inferior races is the fact that the former possess a certain number of highly developed minds, whereas the latter possess no such minds. The individuals of which inferior races are composed display a manifest equality between one another. In proportion as races rise in the scale of civilization, their members tend to become more and more differentiated. The inevitable effect of civilization is to differentiate individuals and races. In consequence, peoples are not progressing towards equality, but towards a growing inequality. The life of a people and all the manifestations of its civilization are merely the reflection of its soul, the visible signs of something invisible but very real. Exterior events are only the apparent surface of the hidden framework by which they are determined. It is neither chance nor exterior circumstances, and less still political institutions, that play the fundamental role in the history of a people. It is more especially the character of a people that fashions its destiny. The various elements of the civilization of a people being only the outward signs of its mental constitution, the expression of certain modes of feeling and thinking peculiar to a people, these elements cannot be transmitted unchanged to peoples of a different mental constitution. All that can be transmitted is the exterior, superficial, and unimportant forms. The profound differences existing between the mental constitutions of the various peoples result in these peoples viewing the world in very dissimilar lights. The consequence is that they feel, reason, and act in very different ways, and they therefore find, when they come in contact, that they are in disagreement on all questions. Most of the wars that take up so large a portion of history are the outcome of these dissentiments. Wars of conquest, wars of religion, wars of dynasties have always in reality been wars of races. An agglomeration of men of different origin do not form a race, do not possess, that is, a collective soul, until, as the result of interbreeding continued during centuries and of a similar existence under identical conditions, the agglomeration has acquired common sentiments, common interests, and common beliefs. Among civilized peoples there are scarcely any natural races, but only artificial races created by historical conditions. Changes of environment only influence profoundly new races, that is, mixtures of old races whose ancestral characteristics have become dissociated by cross-breeding. Heredity is the only force powerful enough to struggle against heredity. Changes of environment have only a destructive action on races, the fixity of whose characteristics has not been affected by cross-breeding. An ancient race perishes rather than undergo the transformations requisite to enable it to adapt itself to a new environment. The acquisition of a solidly constituted collective soul marks the apogee of the greatness of a people. The dissociation of this soul always marks the hour of its decadence. The intervention of foreign elements constitutes one of the surest means of this dissociation being compassed. Like anatomic species, psychological species are subject to the action of time. They too are fated to grow old and die out. Always very slow in being formed, it is possible for them, on the contrary, to disappear rapidly. It suffices to trouble profoundly the functioning of their organs to cause them to undergo retrograde transformations whose consequence is often their prompt destruction. Peoples are centuries long in acquiring a certain mental constitution which they sometimes lose in a very short space of time. The ascending path which leads them to a high level of civilization is always very long, while the decline which leads them to decadence is most often very rapid. Together with character, ideas should be accounted one of the principal factors in the evolution of a civilization. They do not exert an influence until, after a very slow evolution, they have been transformed into sentiments and have come in consequence to form part of the character. They are then unaffected by argument, and take a very long time to disappear. Each civilization is the outcome of a small number of universally accepted fundamental ideas. Religious ideas are among the most important of the guiding ideas of a civilization. The majority of historical events have been due indirectly to the variation of religious beliefs. The history of humanity has always run parallel to that of its gods. Such is the power of these children of our dreams, that even this name cannot be changed without the whole world being thrown at once into confusion. The birth of new gods has always marked the dawn of a new civilization, and their disappearance has always marked its decline. End of The Psychology of Peoples, Its Influence on Their Evolution by Gustave Le Bon.